Beginning in 2011, Senator Parent served in the Georgia House of Representatives, but in 2014 she ran for Senate when her district was gerrymandered. She is a strong advocate for redistricting reform and is the sponsor of legislation that would establish an independent redistricting commission to draw electoral maps in Georgia. Please welcome Senator Elena Parent.
Good afternoon. I am so excited to be here. Wow, this effort has come a long way since the beginning, this time last year, when a number of you started gathering, coming to the state capitol to support SR6 and SR7 legislation that I introduced last year that I'm going to discuss, and also to fight against HB 515, last year's Republican-led effort in the General Assembly to tweak 6 districts, I think it was, to try to, it's a little bit unclear what the purpose was behind a few of them. It certainly wasn't good, but for 4 of them, it was shoring up 2 incumbents, one of whom, once that legislation failed, one of whom has subsequently abandoned that House seat and has been elected to the Senate, and the other of whom has announced that he will not run for re-election, apparently declining to try to present himself to the voters in a district that is getting more purple. So I've been tasked with kind of talking about the recent legislative efforts here in Georgia and kind of sort of some of the primary purpose that all of you have gathered here today to try to advance our cause in Georgia, both from a grassroots and from a legal perspective as well. Some of what I have in here, other speakers have touched on, so I'll move pretty quickly through some of the slides. So, as you know, as Emmett already talked about, districts that are drawn to either lock in certain incumbents or to maximize partisan advantage are problematic in a whole host of ways, and Georgia's districts are, as was said, the least competitive in the country once you start looking down at the state legislative level. I mean, to me, they're part of a sort of unholy trifecta of bad structures that we have in place that lead to bad government for America. And to me, that is a very, very serious problem. When you don't have a government that can cooperate to solve problems, you have put your country at a very serious disadvantage, and I feel like that's what we really have gotten to. Some of the other things that I think contribute to this, and Brian mentioned some of them as well, include the way we do campaign finance. I think that's also a problem, and also, the Citizens United decision, and just the vast amounts of money that Emmett, of course, was just referring to that can dump in anonymous to sort of control this year's or the next census's efforts to make sure that the maps are as unfair as possible to lock in what certain special interests are committed to. I mean, that is really what our system has devolved into, and I think that the danger of that really cannot be overstated. So this is the red map strategy that Emmett was talking about. Since we already talked about that a little bit, I just want to mention that it was really, as Democrats were sort of celebrating, it's so ironic because Democrats after the 2008 elections were just wildly celebrating the new diverse coalition of racial minorities, millennials, college-educated people, et cetera, that were going to make it so that really the White House could never ever be won by a Republican again, because we had the firewall and the industrial Midwest, and we had diversifying populations in Georgia and North Carolina and everywhere else. And meanwhile, the Republicans all gathered in a room and said, okay, here's what we can do. It will cost X millions to try to flip the House of Representatives, but if we can obtain trifectas, which would be, one-party control of different chambers throughout the country, then we will only have to spend X million, a much smaller number, to try to influence state legislative seats and potentially some governor's mansions as well. and we will be able to then draw the maps to take over the House of Representatives at much lower cost. And it worked beautifully. And it also, you know, the increasing danger arises from the way technology has advanced and how you can do these things so precisely. So I do think that the courts, in my estimation, not only do they really have a moral imperative to step in because legislators are uniquely poorly suited to actually draw our own districts, but also because the technology has changed so fast that it has distorted the political process so much that it's a crisis of democracy. Because when there really aren't any, or very many, competitive general election contests, people stay home. The voices, the most loud and rancorous of partisan voices are amplified. Again, that gets back to then the inability of elected officials to actually represent the sort of middle 60 to 80% and solve problems. And really, they're just at loggerheads because the 20% on either side have viewpoints that are diametrically opposed to one another. And then the elected officials representing each of those two sides have zero incentive to try to actually solve any problems because it could lead to their electoral demise within their primary. This is the lessening numbers of contested seats in Georgia in the state Senate. These last three slides that I showed you were actually developed by Sally Harrell, who's here today and is a candidate for Senate District 40, so I want to thank her. Yes. So here's sort of just a recent history of legislative and redistricting efforts here in Georgia. I'm not the best suited person in the room to even describe these things, but if there are more questions, I'm sure Mary Margaret Oliver and Emmett Bonner, I can talk about this a little bit more. But back in 2000, the Democrats controlled all three. We had a Democratic trifecta here in Georgia. The maps ended up not being pre-cleared by the Justice Department. There were also some multi-member districts that I know Representative Oliver served in, as well as a number of our other elected officials who still serve in the General Assembly. And so what that meant is you had a number of elected officials all serving one district, and they were larger. And these were all, this was under when Roy Barnes was governor, and these were all efforts to sort of push back the red wall as Georgia had remained Democratic on the state level, but had started to very consistently elect, I think, the Republican candidate for president, and those in charge knew that in order to remain in charge as long as possible, they were going to need to try to distort the system. And this actually was probably one of the things that the voters pushed back against when Governor Barnes was defeated. It wasn't the primary thing, but I do think that those maps got pretty egregious, and there was an outcry from not only elected officials, but also from the citizenry. Now, when the Republicans gained control of the legislature in 2005 and the maps were thrown out by the courts, they were redrawn by the courts. Governor Perdue took office, and he actually started out as a big advocate for independent redistricting and drawing districts fairly, because he had just sort of, been a part of the process, a very ugly process, because I went through it in 2011, and it's not even like the process isn't good for polite company, and I'm sure it was just the same back then. So he was like, this is horrible, this isn't how these things should be done, these aren't how the citizens should be represented. So he put together a blue ribbon task force to study the issue. Most of the persons who served on that were actually not elected officials. They were various academics, people who served in certain agencies of state government, etc. And they produced a recommendation where they said, for all the reasons that we've already been discussing, that Georgia should move away from partisan and legislative controlled redistricting and should adopt an independent redistricting commission. And they laid out in their report how that should be accomplished, and it was mostly the speaker appoint somebody, and the lieutenant governor appoint somebody, and there were guidelines in there. You ended up with I can't remember exactly, but 8 people who were a bit more removed from the legislature drawing the maps themselves, but they were direct appointments by current elected officials. And there was then sort of the chair would be the more independent voice and the more swing vote. This legislation actually did pass, it's a constitutional amendment, and it did actually, I believe, pass the Georgia Senate, sponsored by the governor's floor leaders and a couple senators that still remain in the Republican caucus today, but it then went nowhere after that, and Governor Perdue apparently dropped the effort. Now, apparently though, he did remain a little bit interested in it because our new president pro tem of the state Senate, Butch Miller out of Gainesville, wonderful guy, I had a meeting with him the other day, and I was asking him that I was saying I really want a hearing, another hearing on SR6 and SR7. That was the purpose of the meeting, why I went to him. But he said that Governor Perdue had come to him and said, I want you to work on this independent commission along with somebody else, and that he basically had declined. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But it did end up, clearing one chamber and then just never went anywhere. And apparently Governor Perdue, and who knows if he ended up thoroughly abandoning the effort or just couldn't get the Republican legislators to end up cooperating with him. But if he did not abandon it himself, he was the only one. The rest of the Republicans in the General Assembly remained committed to being able to redistrict themselves. And they also were smarting in many instances from what they perceived as their unfair treatment after the 2000 census. So many times when I've presented these bills, I get, well, our maps were fantastic, they were pre-cleared. The Democratic maps were never pre-cleared. I mean, that's like the argument back. And sort of what the Democrats did was worse, which of course is a very good argument for why it should not be done by either party, and it should be moved into the hands of independent bodies and citizens. So the first time this is kind of small, sorry y'all. The first time I introduced this type of legislation was in 2011, and Jason Carter had introduced it in the Senate. And I was in the House, and we basically just reintroduced the bill that the Republicans had passed so that our talking point could be, this is a Republican idea, and we should just go ahead and enact it into law. So Jason received a hearing on it. I never did in the House. Once I was elected to the Senate, I still remained committed to this issue. So I introduced SR6 and SR7. Those were not the numbers back then. Those are the numbers this term of the General Assembly. But they basically, the first, in 2015, it was that same bill. Again, I did get a hearing, but no action. Then this year, what a difference a year makes. Because, we had people show up to advocate for the independent commission bill in 2015. But last year, the coalition had just exploded, and all of you and more folks were coming out, and people really started to realize how critical the issue is, and I think in a way that just hadn't penetrated quite so much. I always thought that one of the impediments was the wonky nature, the how does it directly affect me. I don't disagree with Emmett that Attorney General Holder's efforts are not really much better than what the Republicans are trying to do. They're doing it because if there are no structures at the Supreme Court level or states that are doing things fairly, you kind of have to fight back mano a mano, right? So that's what they're doing. But one thing I do say is I do credit them the fact that people at that level of government have raised it as such a desperate issue. I believe that has made it penetrate farther, so I am grateful for that. So this year, we have worked with, so y'all, most of you probably know, we're on 2-year cycles in the General Assembly. So when I did the independent commission bill in 15, I got a hearing in 15 and then, no hearing again. So that's what they're sort of trying to do this year, because they did give me a hearing on SR6 and SR7 last year. Working with a coalition of lawyers and experts, we have modified the legislation slightly going into this term. But at its heart, the independent commission bills as they stand are really far superior to the ones that I was introducing in the House and in 2015 that were based off the Purdue Task Force. There's not direct appointment by elected officials in it anymore. It's a larger group of citizens. People would submit resumes They would be vetted by a group of 3 judges. They would take into consideration things like their analytical abilities, et cetera. And there would be folks chosen, 5 folks that sort of identify as Republicans, 5 as Democrats, and then 5 as independents. But even those that, and you determine that by looking at voting records, it wouldn't just be what they said, you know. But even with the folks who would be considered on the commission to be representing different political parties, they still have a little bit more of a level of removal from the partisan politics than the first version. For example, they couldn't have been donating $2,000 or more. They can't have been a candidate themselves. They can't have a family within the last 10 years. They can't have a family member who's elected. They can't have been a chair of either political party, at the grassroots level, et cetera, et cetera. So you're not, it's designed to, from the top, weed out the most ardent of partisans. So even those that do affiliate with a partisan slant are not your most rabid individuals, which hopefully leads then to a little bit more fairness. What we're adding this year, though, are some really good changes helped by Common Cause and by the ACLU. So we're adding a lot more in about the way the public can the transparency and the way the public can access the proceedings, which we think is really critical. We need to lay all that out so that it actually happens, right? So we want citizens to be able to submit their ideas, provide input, and read the detailed explanations of the reapportionment process. There would be at least 1 public hearing held in the highest populated municipality in each congressional district, and all meetings would be open to the public with adequate notice given. We did remove the communities of interest requirement. That is because a number of folks who work on this issue as their profession have alerted me that the communities of interest requirement, while it sounds good, can be very, very easily subverted to create gerrymanders. So that's why that's not in there this year. So this is just, basically how independent commissions work. Here's a list of states that already have such things: California, Arizona, Idaho, Washington, Montana, and Alaska. They all have they're all slightly different, but they all are vastly superior to the states that have no independent input at all. So of course, 24 states have the process by which voters can collect signatures and have initiatives placed on their ballot. Georgia is not one of those states, so it does leave us at a disadvantage from a grassroots perspective. As this issue has really caught on and penetrated deeper down through the public, there are a bunch of states listed here where those efforts are currently underway. Michigan's, I believe, is definitely appearing on the ballot this fall. Missouri has a slightly different version, and they're pretty close to getting their signatures. Ohio, Oregon, Utah, South Dakota, Colorado, and Pennsylvania, all of those have that. One note back from the rat-bleeped red map strategy, it's interesting to note that some of the states that were targeted under red map, including North Carolina was already mentioned, also included Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Wisconsin. And those, of course, they've all long been swing districts, but they also became the states that really delivered Donald Trump his victory. And let's not, people pay attention to the national news, but one of the dangers of these extreme gerrymanders and having one party have so much less of a voice is that people then, even more than already happens with our media bubbles, hear one side of things. If you don't have as many elected officials, you don't have people showing up at your county commission that represent an alternate viewpoint so that you could actually have full information. So to me, it's not really a surprise at all that the more you gerrymander, the more you end up with the same electoral outcome because it snowballs. So these are, I want to talk about each one of these things very briefly. Because we cannot do a citizen-led ballot initiative, we are at a little bit of a disadvantage. But the power of this movement and the amount that it has increased in the last year or two has already made such great strides. already had huge impact, and there's just some to-dos to have it achieve our ultimate goal. So with HB 515, that bill was killed because of those of you who started working heavily in this issue. It absolutely was. Once hundreds of people were paying attention, the same bill passed 2 years earlier. They did the same thing. In fact, one of the same districts, and they were just trying to, gerrymander it a little bit more to protect the guy. No one had said anything 2 years ago. Just sailed on through. This time, it was completely different. Folks showed up. Organizations put their eyes on it. It's almost like people didn't realize the real danger until it went so far. And then people woke up and said, wow, this is actually a real problem. And that's what killed 515, the importance of which cannot be understated. So even if, yes. So even if we can't in the next 3 years achieve getting the citizen commissions done, see, you can still achieve 60% or more of your goal even without that. Because first of all, you killed their efforts to actually affirmatively gerrymander last year. Then if you're just on them and there's groups and media and unfavorable things out all the time, it makes them nervous. And they know it looks bad. It's not popular in the public. It's not a good electoral strategy for many people to proudly run around and announce that they're gonna vote for egregious maps. And as long as the public is paying attention and lots of people engage, then the fact is the things they produce will actually be less bad from go. So we still don't take our eye off the ball. But the point is, don't think that that's the only benchmark of success. So what we're doing now is, as I said, I met with President Pro Tem Miller to request that I get another hearing on SR6 and SR7. At that time, I want to substitute in the new version so that the numbers stay the same. I will have to let you all know if we decide to take another trajectory, in which case I would introduce the new versions and they would have different numbers. But I would rather keep them the same because we've been working on them. Meanwhile, the efforts of the group were so impressive last year that the chairman of the Senate Reapportionment Committee, Senator Ben Watson from Savannah, actually not only abandoned that chairmanship, he also asked to get off the committee entirely. And from Senator Brass, I keep getting, well, I agree with you about the problem, I just don't agree with your solution. So we need to drill down on that a whole lot more. He is a good guy. He's not particularly powerful. He came in only a year ago. Typically, the people that are chairman of redistricting are not the most powerful. So I'm very focused on the President Pro Tem, the majority leader. President Pro Tem is Butch Miller, majority leader is Bill Cousert, and the Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle, as well as David Schaefer. He's our former President Pro Tem, who is now running for Lieutenant Governor. And the more, those are the folks who will really decide if we're able to get a hearing. So my immediate goal this year is that I really want us to have a hearing because, and I've told Butch, listen, the landscape in this area is moving so quickly. It is very important for our reapportionment committee to be up to date on all of the shifting landscape as far as what's happening in the courts, as well as what's happening with ballot petitions, etc. So I'm gonna, I know you all have been calling and emailing, so we do want to keep that up. Focus on Brass, yes, maybe he will go and say, I'm just getting totally hammered. He represents, we need to look at his district. It's kind of like Coweta and Troop and a little bit of Fulton and something else. What we need is to get his folks to start demanding a hearing. So the charge for all of you is, in order to build the movement to where we can get the majority party to say, yes, we are gonna move these forward for a vote, you are charged with finding Republicans in their areas that support the non-rigging districts because they want to elect the people. So that's your charge. Everyone can't be resident in Mary Margaret Oliver's district and my district. Because otherwise, one of the reasons that Ben Watson, I think, ultimately got us a hearing is that I do have a lot of contacts in Savannah, and we were able to get a lot of folks from Savannah to say, we are interested in this, we think it's important, and we want there to be a hearing. So you're charged with building a coalition that includes Republicans, especially Republicans that are residents of these folks' districts. The other thing is, really briefly, I'm worried about the census. I know y'all, I just want to mention it really briefly. I'm really nervous that they won't fund it properly, that because of Donald Trump's efforts and just rhetoric, that a lot of minorities will be very scared to even put their names on a census. The census is supposed to reflect everybody who lives in the country, citizen or not. It's directly tied not only to the way districts are drawn, but also to the amount of federal funding that we get. In short, it is incredibly critical, and it is actually pretty easy to subvert. So I just want everyone's eyes on that, because that's so critical. Then, you know, if we can't get our independent commission passed before our next census, if we don't win the governor's mansion, and you know, we're faced with basically the same legal landscape that we have now, then we're going to need to sue the pants off the maps, which we did not do this time. So never again will we not sue. So I think that is it. I just want to thank y'all for your efforts. It is just so inspiring, and thank you. Oh, one more thing. I do want to say that John Barrow, who's here and running for Secretary of State, was redistricted out of his congressional seat like 4 times. So we're glad that he's here and paying attention to this issue and is going to be a loud voice for reform on the campaign trail throughout the year. So thank you all.